Amen. Well, if you would go in your notes, by the way, it's Saturday, right? You just had lunch. What comes next? It may be I'm here to facilitate that, But... Oh, wait, am I on? I think I turned myself on. Is that on? All right, well, I want to go to page 3. And this is a bit of a non sequitur, perhaps, but I think it relates. And well, let me just tell you. And notice at the top of page 3, I gave this sort of a secondary title: God's Plan of Redemption Put in Its Place. What I mean by that, and it's almost marginally heretical to even talk that way, like I can do, but I think the Bible, and this is the case that we've been making, that the Bible does not regard the plan of redemption as the center of human history and as glorious and bottomlessly blessed as it is. And that, in point of fact, well, I'll say it again, God's purpose in human history is His own glory, and to that end, He has formed a relationship with a people called Israel. And in short, the primary vehicle by which He will demonstrate His glory is His faithfulness to that covenant. And of course, that faithfulness is going to be the more staggering or more stunning given the hardness of Israel. All right? Now, I want to go back, and I have a 7-point, and I'm not going to get through all of them. They're all on your sheets there on the next couple of pages. And again, this is a set of ideas I put together, Randy, that I always use when I take people to Israel. And but I thought it might help here, just because, again, I'm trying to kind of rethink the construct, or recalibrate our approach to the Scriptures almost, or to what God is doing in the Scriptures. And there is this notion, and it's very, very popular, and I think sometimes we who know better, or I should say we who would not consciously embrace such an idea, nonetheless we kind of fall prey to it a little bit. It works in our minds that pretty much in the Old Testament God was doing through Israel what He does through the church today. Now, this has formal articulation and formation in replacement theology, and I'm confident that the mood in this room would not be warmly affected by that. I mean, I don't think that's where we want to go, but by the same token, let's put it this way. What God is doing in and through Israel in the Old Testament is so counterintuitive that you have to kind of grab yourself by the neck and focus rather carefully. And the reason I'm going to do that for a couple of minutes, next couple of sessions, is because I think, and I say there, start from the beginning to make sense of the whole. So let's go back and think about God's dealings with Israel in the Old Testament. And although this is not the central focus of where I want to go, but I think it's important to acknowledge that what He's doing is dramatically unlike what He's doing today through the church. Now, if we're talking about individual salvation, that's something very different. And that'd be worthy of discussion. But I'm just saying, in terms of God putting Himself on display to the world, the Old Testament, what He does in the Old Testament is rather dramatically distinct. So I call it the nation of Israel and the purposes of God, and I got 4 here. I'm going to give you the first 4, because that's all the time we'll have for. I can review the others quickly. They're on your sheet, and well, just follow with me. The first concept there. Have I done this? I hope. If this is review, forgive me for you guys. But the first concept I call the intent and importance of Israel's influence. Now, what's at stake here is that. Well, let me back up and say, first of all, what's not at stake, which is, I think, very witlessly but commonly assumed. And that is that in choosing Israel, God is somehow undervaluing or rejecting all the other peoples of the world. And there is a certain, think about it. God chooses Israel in Genesis chapter 12. Now, I said this earlier just in passing, but let's do the arithmetic real quickly. Can you give me a date for Abraham?
2000 BC.
About 2000. Now, in point of fact, he is born in 2166, and he is called in 2091. So let's modify that to 2100 BC. In other words, Genesis 12 happens in 2091 BC. Now, let me ask you real quickly. Do you know how we get there? Is it worth taking the time? I can do it quickly. Kev?
We go from 1 Kings 6:1.
Bingo. Do you know that verse?
Back 480 years to the Exodus. You go 430 years back to Genesis
All right.
12.
Let me say it through the microphone. He's exactly right. Well, that gets you back to Jacob. So the 430 years gets you back to Jacob's descent into Egypt. All right. And I think this is significant. I always say that it is hard data and simple arithmetic. It's because the Bible says in 1 Kings chapter 6 that Solomon began to build his temple in his 4th year. And then, which we can identify, and I won't get into it, it's a very accessible set of ideas, but believe me, nobody questions this data. I mean, lost, saved, everybody will acknowledge the legitimacy of this data. Might fudge a year or two here and there, but that the 4th year of Solomon was 966 BC. And then there in 1 Kings 6:1, you have what seems for all the world to be almost a throwaway line. You wonder why the chronicler, the prophet, under God's superintending ministry, threw this line in. It says, in the 4th year, Solomon began to build the temple in his 4th year, 966 BC. That's not in the text, but that's what it was. And then it says this, which was 480 years after the children of Israel came out of Egypt. It seems like a bit of an orthogonal statement. I mean, what's that got to do with anything? But the fact is that it's absolutely basic to our ability to calculate any sort of chronology before Solomon. So now, as Kevin said, you got 480 years after the Exodus, so you take your 966, you add 480 years. Our data, simple arithmetic, 1446 BC. So Israel came out of Egypt in 1446 BC. I'm just going to say, for full disclosure, and I realize some of you are probably very conversant with this, there are a couple of fudge factors and issues along the way, but it's going to be just a handful of years. So this is the standard recreation. So if the Exodus happened in 1446, the Bible says that they were in Israel. This is Exodus 12, verse 40. Says Israel came out after they had been there 430 years. As to the day, they were there 430 years. 1446, out of 430, we got 1876, right? 1876 is the year that Jacob went down into Egypt with his clan of 70. And it says when he went down, he was 130 years of age. So we can add 1876, 130. What do we got, 20-6? No. Yeah, 20-6. And that is the birth of Jacob, because he went down, he was 100 years old. Well, Jacob's daddy was Isaac. Isaac was 60. So now we add 20-6 plus the 60, that's 2066, right? And then Abraham, the age of Abraham at the birth of Isaac, in other words, 2066 is the birth of Isaac. And one of the better known little chronological data points in the Old Testament is how old was Abraham when he had Isaac? He was 100, so now 2166. So, here's my point. The most recent date you can assign creation is what? And this is where I would put it. I'm a young earth freak, okay? But where would you put the most recent date? About 4,000, right? 4,000 BC. That's 6,000 years ago. Everybody on board so far? This is dangerous stuff, talking about this right after lunch, I know, but shake yourself. Now, here's my point. If creation is, say, 4,000, and Abraham is, say, 2,100, that's 1,900 years, right? So from creation to Abraham is no less, by any reconstruction, than 1,900 years. Now, Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament, and he writes about when? About 400, right? So now you've got from 1900 BC to 400 BC. Am I right about that? Yeah, 1900 to 400. which is, 2100. I lost my way. From 2100 to 400, which is 1700 years. You see where I'm taking you? There is more human history in Genesis 1 to 11 than there is in the rest of the Old Testament, by any configuration. Now, I emphasize that because in a lot of people's minds, the work of salvation kind of begins with the Abrahamic covenant. But that's 1,900 people, 1,900 years of people who are a little upset about that. You know what I'm saying? So, clearly, and the point to be made is simply this, that, and I believe that as soon as man rebelled, God set out to redeem. And the promise of the seed of the woman in Genesis 3, as a matter of fact, I will suggest that immediately after the fall, God established two lines of redemptive truth. And the one is the promise of Genesis 3:15. And that the seed of the woman. Now, I didn't really sit under him. I worked under him, and I cherished the man. And he was a great theologian. But he insisted that all the Genesis 3:15, and this is much the fashion today, all the Genesis 3:15, when I'll put enmity between the woman and the seed of the serpent, and all that meant was that women would forever be afraid of snakes. I don't think that's what's going on there. I think there's more at stake there. So do you. And the fact is that it's a promise of redemption. I don't want to get too deeply into it, but the point is that God, first of all, makes a promise of a seed of woman. Secondly, he makes a provision. And that provision is of a covering for nakedness that was provided by God. It provided animal skins. Do you remember? Now, folks, honestly, I'll tell you something. Those animals did not zip off those skins. What you have there is the shed blood of an innocent victim of God's provision to cover the sin of a sinning person. And I think those two lines, I like to say, you can chart them, that all throughout the Old Testament you have, first of all, this marvelous promise of a Redeemer. And to be personally saved in the Old Testament, number one, and let me say this before I finish that thought. I think we are guilty of abstracting so many things. The Greco-Roman mind, our mind, we can make it. And we've done it with faith. Faith is just some sort of mystical mental energy by which we embrace a truth claim aggressively. I made that up while I stand there. I mean, it's just like you sit in a dark corner and you're in a dark room and you close your eyes and you say, I believe. I really believe. Well, listen, I think the best biblical synonym in our language for faith, honestly, is allegiance. The point is that God makes certain claims concerning who he is and the right that he has to rule in your life. And we are rebels, and we need to repent of that, and we need to give our allegiance. All throughout Old Testament, the issue is allegiance. Now, when you give your allegiance, you really swear your allegiance to someone in your life. You're going to obey them. You're going to trust them. You're basically going to depend upon them. And so all of that's kind of bound up. But that's what's going on. If a person has given his allegiance to Yahweh, acknowledged his claims, then he is going to embrace this blessed promise that there is coming a deliverer who can crush the head of the tempter, can absolutely vanquish the tempter. So on the one hand, you have this promise. On the other hand, you have this provision of a sin covering that can only be provided through an innocent victim of God's provision. Because the wages of sin is death, and God never had to deliberate that. And it's always been thus. But on the other hand, God will accept the shed blood, the death of an innocent victim of his instruction, his provision, what he has demanded, and that death will be accepted as yours. Now, here's the thing. If you can imagine those two lines running throughout the Old Testament, and they're both seminal in Genesis 3, 15 and 21. That is sort of the seed promise. Just that I realize the one is the promise of a seed, but I'm thinking that the promise itself starts primitively, like we like to say, just as a seed, but it's going to grow throughout the Old Testament. We're going to grow so much more about the seed of the woman. And we're going to have so much more instruction about what it is that God demands in terms of a sin covering and so on. But it never, ever compromises in any way that basic seed promise. That makes sense to you? Now, here's the question. Watch this. I should be able to draw for you. But if you can imagine, you got these two lines. The promise of a deliverer, the provision of a covering. In time, we discover that there's only one line. That the promised deliverer is also the covering for sin. Where in the history of redemption, in the history of the progress of Revelation, where do they come together? See, I would argue only after the cross. That's what we talked about before. It doesn't seem to me that there's any biblical evidence that the Old Testament saint was really anticipating Messiah to be the dying sin covering. But that is the blessedness of living on this side of that event revelation, which is the cross. That makes sense to you? Now, having said that, my point is, I stopped there only for this reason, that so when it comes to the business of personal salvation, I think the plan of salvation is in the Old Testament just what it is in the New Testament in terms of trusting the promise God has given you and obeying the demands of God. I don't want to go necessarily there because it's going to sound like work salvation, but giving your allegiance. You know, the Bible never struggles, especially the Old Testament, with any sort of disparity or dissonance even between faith and obedience. I don't like to say works, but faith and obedience. It becomes an issue kind of in the New Testament with the Judaizers and so on, but you have, even in the New Testament, you have Jesus saying that in the tribulation, anybody who gives a cup of cold water, that's why you'll be accepted in the kingdom. So that's how you get in the kingdom, is give a cup of cold water to one of the... No, that's not the point at all. The point is that the dynamic there, the context is of the tribulation, when there will be great persecution of God's people, and if you will identify with God's people and the system and so on, you're giving steps, you're giving feet to your claim to your faith commitment. All right, I lose my way entirely, don't I? The point is that has to do with the business of personal conversion. What we're talking about here doesn't relate to that very much, and that is what God is doing. But let me come way back to it. So you've got Abraham. Here's the point to be made here, is that in the course of the Old Testament, you have from creation till Abraham, when God is dealing, and we often refer to, I do anyway, to those early chapters of Genesis 1 to 11 as universal dealings. Because in those chapters, God is dealing with a race as a race. God turns a remarkable and important corner in Genesis 12, where he's been working with the race, and now he goes to Abraham. And there's more time out there in Genesis 1 to 11. It's quickly told, but there's more time out there than there is in the rest of the Old Testament. So we're over halfway through Old Testament history when God does a remarkable thing. And that is, he goes to one individual and forms a covenant relationship with that one individual, right? So, what's it got to do with anything? Well, Genesis 1 to 11 is pretty much, as I say, an unbroken... You have creation, then you have the fall, then you have the overspreading of the earth with evil, you have the flood, then you have the Tower of Babel. So you have this pretty much unbroken record of wickedness and rebellion on the part of mankind as a whole, and then God turns to Abraham specifically, and it's very, very easy and dangerous to fall into the notion that in turning to Abraham, he was rejecting the rest of the world. And that somehow the spirit is that if the rest of the human race won't follow me, maybe I can get this one people, this one nation to follow me. And that is absolutely wrong. It's dangerous, and that's the only point I'm making here. That I'll go a little further, just a second here, that I can read it back there. So the concept is that, all right, saying it positively, the reason God chose Israel was to use Israel to put himself on display to the world. And there are two. I said earlier that, and I think this is it's a helpful and I think biblically accurate way to regard God's dealings with Israel, that And to this day, Jews tend to think of, the Jewish people tend to think of themselves as having two fathers. The father of the family was Abraham, the father of the nation was Moses. So God calls Abraham and his family in Genesis 12, and that family grows large in Egypt, and God brings them out, miraculously brings them to Mount Sinai, and the family of Abraham becomes the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai. Now, without going too deeply into that, the point is that at both of those huge turning points, or those very important turning points in Israel's history, his relationship with God, you have explicit in the record that God is choosing them. In Genesis 12, in calling Abraham, he says, I will make you a blessing to all nations. And then in Exodus 19, and this is a phrase I want you to remember, you're probably familiar with it, many of you, but there are two phrases in Exodus 19. I'll go to it. Exodus 19, my beloved professor, Dr. Raleigh McCune, used to insist, would always insist that there's as much theology nestled away in these two verses. I mean, so basic to everything else that God does in the Old Testament. Because here we are at Mount Sinai. God has miraculously brought the children of Israel reluctantly. By the way, you know what? I think if you could have called a meeting of the truly twice born among those who followed Moses out of Egypt, those millions of people, you may have been able to convene that meeting in a phone booth. Honest to goodness. I mean, I'm being a little bit hyperbolic. But not many of those people. Matter of fact, they were mad. They were reluctant. They didn't want to leave. They were madly in love with all things Egyptian. And they were anxious to go back. And I think, well, that's for later. But my point is that in Exodus 19, here we are at the foot of Mount Sinai. The glory cloud has taken up its residence up on the top of the mountain. And God begins to speak. And he offers Israel a covenant. By the way, we call this the Mosaic covenant, the Sinaitic covenant, or the Old covenant. This is the Old covenant. There's only one covenant in the Bible which God intended to wax old and pass away. And that was this covenant. Well, I'll leave it alone. Exodus 19:5, he says in verse 5, now therefore, he's speaking. God is speaking now. And of course, this is fearsome to the nation. But he says, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people. So I'm going to have a relationship with you that I have with no other people. But he goes on to say, for all the earth is mine. So he's not rejecting his relationship, but he's saying, I'm going to have a special relationship with you. But then he says this, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now, folks, I am persuaded that those two phrases really sum up the distinctives of God's dealings with Israel. He says, not the distinctive, but the sum of what he is doing. He says that I will make you, first of all, a kingdom of priests. Now, what does that mean? Well, it certainly doesn't mean that everybody in Israel gets to be a priest, right? We know that. He's going to single out the tribe of Levi and then the house of Aaron to be priests. What it does mean, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is I will make you a kingdom, a nation, with a priestly function. And so the point is that God is going to, what does a priest do? He mediates. So God is going to mediate the truth concerning himself to the world through Israel. And, quite frankly, by the same token, this is why I said before that in the Old Testament, Gentiles could get saved. But the only way that could happen is if you, to one degree or another, surrendered your Gentileness and identified with Israel. This is dramatic in Ruth. She says, your people will be my people, and your God will be my God, and your people will be my people. Now, it wasn't always quite that dramatic. I always think of, I can't say his name, for heaven's sakes, the Syrian leper who gets healed in the days of Elisha. Naaman. You remember Naaman comes, and after he dips himself in that muddy river 7 times and comes up clean of his leprosy, he goes back to the prophet Elisha. And it's curious, he says basically, I work for a man, or I'm the servant of a man, I'm supported by a man who every day goes down to the Baal house. And he leans on my arm. Is it okay if I go? And Elijah basically says, okay, go. But then Naaman takes some dirt from Israel. And I picture him taking it back there and spreading it out on the ground, and having his prayer to Yahweh and so on. I mean, and the point being that he has deliberately rejected he has embraced Israel. Now, let me just say this real quickly, that seems so foreign to us, so terribly foreign to us. The only way to be right with God is to identify with Israel. Well, number one, understand this, that in antiquity, one of the most important, if not the most important element of what it meant to be a part of a certain people is to worship their God. Now again, they're polytheists. You can worship as many gods you want. But this is Daniel 3 once again. If you're going to be part of this country, you're going to worship Baal. And there's another dynamic to this, because the king rules in the name of those gods. So it's treasonous to abandon those gods. Now you can have other gods if you want, but as I said earlier, the problem is that the first demand that Yahweh makes of you is that you acknowledge that He's the only one true God, and all of the gods are counterfeits, so you have to turn from idols to serve the living God. So the point is that to one degree or another, you had to embrace. So I'm saying that when God says, I'm going to make you a kingdom with a priestly function, a nation with a priestly function, the idea is God is going to take the light concerning Himself, the truth concerning Himself, and He's going to put it on display through His dealings with Israel. And by the way, can I tell you something? It really worked. Look at 1 Samuel 4 real quickly. I'm jumping ahead, but I'm jumping around. But I love this passage. This is the "Here I Raise My Ebenezer" passage. This is kind of a thing with me. But I don't like the fact that the second verse of Robinson's song has been changed, to insipid poetry. Yeah, but the reason that, I won't get into it. But in 1 Samuel 4, this is the story, and I regard 1 Samuel 4 to 7 as sort of the pivot of the whole Old Testament. This really is a hugely, hugely important story. But all I want out of it is the reaction of the Philistines. Because you remember what happened. The Israelites, because Psalm 78:60, God, given the wickedness of Israel, had abandoned His tent in Shiloh, the glory cloud left for a season of over 100 years. Next time we encounter the glory cloud, after He leaves here in about 1110 BC, is when the glory cloud moves into Solomon's newly constructed temple in 1 Kings 8. But the point is that the Ark of the Covenant has been carried into captivity and captured. And once it was, what I want is in 1 Samuel 4, first of all, when it was carried into captivity, and the Philistines, who again they were on yonder hills, and the Philistines had spies, and they could look across the valley even and see what was going on. And when they heard that the Israelites had brought the Ark of the Covenant into the camp, verse 7 says they were afraid, for they said, God has come into the camp. They said, woe to us, such a thing has never happened before. And by the way, pagans didn't treat their gods with this kind of carelessness. Matter of fact, your warfare was to protect your God. But then they said this, verse 8, and I love this verse. They said, woe to us, who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods that struck the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness. That was 400 years earlier. So 400 years have gone by, and still these Philistines are smitten with fear when they hear about. And there's another point here. If you go over to chapter 6, you know what? I'll read you a verse. I'm just going to read the verse, and you tell me just sort of intuitively, who might you think is speaking in this verse? Why then do you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts? When he did mighty things among them, did they not let the people go that they might depart? I mean, why do you harden your hearts like the Egyptians hardened their hearts? 1 Samuel 6 and verse 6, those are the Philistine elders. They have come to the realization that everywhere the ark goes, gods are falling on their faces, and hands are being chopped off, and everybody's coming up with these boils. And well, I'll leave it alone with that. But anyway, so they come up with the idea of sending it back. But many of the Philistines don't want to send it back. This is a hard-fought victory. We got the Ark of the Covenant. And so they stand there and they say, why do you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaohs hardened their hearts? These Philistines knew the book of Exodus. That's astounding that they could. They not only could they remember the Red Sea and the destruction of the Egyptian army, but they were they were able to talk about it in terms of the way God describes what's going on. I'm telling you. All right, I'm going to come back to it here. I'll get ahead of myself. There's another verse in Esther that always strikes me right at the end of chapter 6, and I love the book of Esther, but it's the story, it's after wicked Haman. And by the way, this could be an extensive by the way, but listen, I said earlier that I think the two books in the Old Testament that are really instructive with regard to our day are Daniel, who gives us this times of the Gentiles and helps us understand that what we're living through is really a time of it's a time when just that Israel is under the heel of Gentile dominion and God's name is dishonored. It's not a happy thing. We ought to understand this age in which we live. Esther is important because it explains how God is going to protect His people in this age, in these ages. I think you ought to take the book of Esther and lay it over just as a template over our entire the times of the Gentiles. You know what I'm saying? God knows how. You know, Esther comes right after the end of the theocracy, and it happens during the Persian period, what we call the Restoration period. Esther actually falls between Ezra 6 and 7. And that's this Restoration period. Ezra and Nehemiah describe it. And it's a period that is horribly, horribly neglected in most Christian circles and so on. We don't pay much attention to it. And I like to say the reason is because it doesn't reduce itself very well to flannel graph. The fact is that there are no miracles. There are no miracles. You know, I always think that if you were part of that group that was coming back under Zerubbabel to rebuild the temple in Ezra 1 to 6, it'd be best not to be having your devotions out of Exodus, you know, and Numbers, reading about this bread falling out of heaven all day. We got no bread falling out of heaven. We got to go find bread, for heaven's sakes, you know, and the water flowing out of the side of a rock and walls falling out and so on. That's what happened the last time God brought Israel out of a bondage, you know, under Egypt. We got to do it ourselves. Why? Because there is no miracle. And the point is that Esther, in Esther, God is making the point, I think, that He will no longer supernaturally intervene. Now, okay, maybe I got to be so careful here. He'll no longer miraculously intervene. Does that make sense to you? Now, again, you're dubious because you're saying, if you're going to have this conversation, I keep saying you got to be real careful about your definition of miracle, right? Miracle is not just a happy intervention by God. I always say, you're going to the doctor, you know, and you're late, and there's never a parking place, and you got to get there, and you pull in. There's a big parking place. Oh man, it was a miracle. It's not a miracle. I'm not saying God wasn't in it. It was providence, and those are two important. I use this illustration all the time. I probably have in your presence, but I always say you're going down the street, and you know, you're just driving along, and a car pulls out, and you don't see it till the very last minute. You kind of throw on your brakes and spin your wheels and shut your eyes and wait for the crash, and it never happens. You open your eyes, you say, I don't know how that happened. It was a miracle. And I always say I'm not here to say that God wasn't in it. He was in it. And I'm not here to say that maybe your guardian angel didn't have to go lay down somewhere for a few minutes, if you know what I'm saying. But by the same token, here's my point. You're going down the street, a car pulls out, you don't see it at the last minute, your car levitates in the air about 30 feet, the other car passes under, your car comes gently back to earth. Now you're getting close to a miracle. You don't have, honest to goodness, by biblical definition, you don't have a miracle unless you have the palpable interruption of the laws of nature in such a way that nothing can explain it except divine intervention. Now that's what God did again and again and again. But now, after the glory cloud departed and the theocratic rule was suspended, God did not abandon Israel. He did not abandon the Abrahamic covenant. But now He is going to intervene providentially in ways that take the eye of faith to recognize. And that's exactly what God has done. I give you all sorts of illustration, but that's what God is doing today in Israel. That makes sense to you? So I think those two Old Testament books you got that really kind of speak to this age and how we understand what God is doing and how we ought to react to it. And with regard to Daniel, you got these times of the Gentiles, which by biblical standards, by the way it's laid out in Daniel 2 and 7, is pretty much stinking up the countryside, right? I mean, so let's acknowledge that this is a time that is characterized by governmental defiance of God. By the way, I didn't make this point, but I think it's interesting that in Daniel 2, when Nebuchadnezzar has the vision, the dream, it's something to be kind of admired. But in Daniel 7, when God lays it out, it's ravenous, rapacious beasts. They're monsters and so on. I think that the contrast is very deliberate. So I go back to it. In Esther, I think, on the other hand, it teaches us, you know what, I know that this business of our relationship to Israel, okay, I'm rather unapologetically Zionistic. I believe that Israel as a people have a right biblically and historically and politically and morally to the land in which they have been amazingly planted. Not miraculously. Ask the people who died in those wars. Not miraculously, but amazingly, the providence of God. I was at the Independence Hall several months ago, where they take you through the process of the birth of the State of Israel the night they declared the Declaration of Independence. And the guy was telling stories, and this docent, this guide, this very, very good, very, very effective, very Israeli, very compelling story and so on. But he said, you can't know anything about Israel and not believe in miracles. Now, he was misusing miracles, but I understood what he meant. And then he said this, I'm not a religious man. I don't even believe there is a God. But you can't know anything about Israel and not believe in miracles. So it's pretty fundamentally incoherent, I admit to you. But the point is that see, that's the book of Esther. It's just the book of Esther writ large over this entire time called the times of the Gentiles. And here is this little people and so with regard to what are we going to do with it? And this is my response. I think, and by the way, before I say that, might I just say that the worst thing you can do with Esther is clean it up. That was not a beauty pageant. We don't want to talk about what was going on there over much, but it was not a beauty pageant. Esther had no business in the wide, wide world being involved. They say, well, she had no choice. Yeah, she did. It was probably death. But that would have been the only noble choice, as far as I'm concerned. And that's the point. You have these two this anti-hero and this anti-heroine, this fully assimilated courtier who rather enjoys his status, is so much so. And by the way, godly Jews were back in Jerusalem at that time. Now these people had stayed behind and were enjoying a good life there in Persia and so on. And then you have this strikingly beautiful Jewess who consents to be a part of this unspeakable wickedness in making herself attractive to the king and so on. And yet when there is an existential threat, when they, Mordecai first and then Esther, discover that there is threat against Israel at her very existence, then they fly to the defense and they abandon all other issues of life and so on. They put their lives at stake. It is the perfect paradigm of Israel's history. You know what I'm saying? And including the fact that the Zionist movement that gave birth to Israel, now, here I am talking about this, and now I'm starting to break into a cold sweat because nobody knows it better than Randy, and I have used his notes for some years. But the fact is that it was as godless a movement as there ever was. The Zionist movement was thoroughly socialist, largely communistic, almost entirely atheistic, just as Esther was an unworthy tool, but God used her, so Israel, in spite of themselves, God has preserved them providentially. And I like to say that if the question before the House, just for the moment, is, what should our attitude be toward Israel, toward the state of Israel? I think it's fair to say that you can ask that question another way. And that is, had you been alive in the days of Esther, whose side would you have been on, Haman's or Mordecai's? It's that simple for me. I'm not saying they can't do anything wrong or haven't done anything wrong, and I'm not saying they shouldn't be corrected when they do, but It comes down to whose side ought you to be on. And I'm on Mordecai's side. I'm on that side. But all that to say, that wasn't the side. Because I mentioned earlier that I think those two books are really kind of uniquely focused. That is, they have a tremendous amount to say to us as to how we ought to understand the day in which we're living. That makes sense? And our relationship to Israel. But I only got off on that because of Esther chapter 6. And this is where Haman, don't you love this part of the story? Haman had found himself outside the door. He had gone there to ask for permission to kill all the Jews. To kill Mordecai. He had gone there to ask permission to kill Mordecai. I'd already got permission to kill all the Jews, but Mordecai wouldn't genuflect, and he was so blistered about it, he just decided, I'm going to go and ask. So he's there early in the morning. Meanwhile, the king has slept all night, and somebody brought him the annals, and he read the story of how Mordecai had saved the king's life. And so, he's groggy early in the morning, and he says, man, I forgot all about that. I need to do something good for Mordecai, but I can't think of anything. Is there anybody around here who can advise me? Remember this delightful part of the story? And they call Haman in. Haman's out here, and of course, his wife had told him, just go ahead and build a gallows. He'll give you permission to do it. So this is where Mordecai, Ahasuerus the king, in the middle, early in the morning, calls in Haman and says, if there were a man in my kingdom, and I want to do something really nice for him, what could I do? And of course, Haman thinks he's talking about himself. So he says, I'd get him a big white horse, and I'd ride him through town, and I'd have everybody bow to him, and that'd be great. And the king said, that's a great idea. Go do that for Mordecai. So he's got to go, parade Mordecai through town. And he's blistered about it, and he goes home, and he's whining to his family. And he tells his family that Mordecai is Jewish. And the reaction of Haman's family is stunning. It's right there in verse 13, where Haman told his wife, Zeresh, and his friends, everything that had happened to him. And his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you'll not prevail against him. No, you see what I'm saying? Is that God determined to put himself on display through Israel. And I'm telling you, it was effective. So effective that in the latter days of the judges, when they took the ark into battle against the Philistines are saying, oh, what was us? This is that same God. And, well, I'll leave it alone. So, the point is that God's... Oh, no, I can't leave it alone. I'm sorry. The point is that in Exodus 19, God says, I will make you a kingdom with a priestly function. So as a nation, I'm going to put myself on display. But he goes further. He says, to that end, I'll also make you a holy nation. What's holy mean? Set apart. So I am going to make you distinct from the rest of the world. So those two elements of God's plan, I'm going to make you a kingdom with a priestly function, and to that end, I think we could say, I'm going to make you a set-apart nation. Now watch how that unfolds. So my point is, in this, that the intent of God was always that Israel would be a light to the nations, and he makes that point both in choosing Abraham in Genesis 12 and in offering a covenant to Israel in Exodus 19. And so, in a very, very practical way, this is almost universal. That there is this spirit that says, well, what right do the Jews have to say that they've got some special relationship with God? They're saying that God loves them. And I'll tell you something. The error can occur on both sides. The Jews sometimes think of themselves as somehow, in a very special sense, worthy of God's favor and so on. There's none of that in this. And I'll tell you something else. This is really my last point, but I'll never get there at this rate, will I? But I'll tell you something else. This is not an easy assignment. That is, to be the people who will represent Yahweh before a fallen world. Now they do it haltingly. They do it reluctantly. But God has formed a relationship by which they, in a way no other people does, that they bear his name to the world. And I always think at this point of Tevye. Do you like Fiddler on the Roof? Do you have no soul, spirit, whatever, if you don't like Fiddler on the Roof? But you remember that if I were a rich man moment, maybe you could have chosen somebody else. You remember? And that really bespeaks this reality that, you know what, I don't believe that you can make any sense in any era, but especially in our own. You can't make any sense of the moral insanity that grips a people. An imbalance, but it's more than imbalance. It's absolute, a perverted moral worldview that is unable to distinguish between Israel's determination to protect her children and her enemy's determination to slaughter those children. And somehow each of those is equally condemnable. And there's some cycle of violence that's going on because Israel insists on taking steps to protect her own and so on. I don't think you can make any sense of that moral insanity if you don't insinuate the spiritual dynamic. That Israel, reluctantly, haltingly, but inevitably, because of the covenant that God made with them, they bear the name of Yahweh to a world which despises Yahweh. And because they despise Yahweh, they're going to despise the people that bear His name. That makes sense to you? So I'm just saying that on the one hand, in choosing Israel, God is not rejecting. He's not misusing any other people. But by the same token, and I think this is why Paul insists that we ought to be grateful to Israel because they have borne the name of Yahweh. All right, I'll leave it alone. Secondly, and this is huge, is the principle of providential placement. And I always say, I'm going to do a little geography here. This church is well taught in geography, and most of what I know I learned from Randy, for heaven's sakes. And I know you just say geography and your eyes tend to glaze over and so on, but this is hugely important stuff. You know, there is no accident in the way God shaped the world. And I think this is so manifest and so important. It's explicit in the Scripture. God says in Ezekiel, I'm going to put you in the center of the nations. But I think there's a strategy here. And I say here that what's at stake is that God placed Israel at the most strategic spot on the most important international highway in the ancient world. Now, again, you know this, that basically civilization, the cradle, as civilization began to develop, every evidence is, and when I talk about civilization development, folks, if you're picturing, a really hairy guy dragging a woman out of a cave and beating rocks together, okay, so we're talking about 3 families coming off the ark, encountering an ecology very different than what they had known, and given commands to overspread the earth with God-honoring culture. Now, they're going to rebel against that, but the point is that as cultures and civilization begin to develop, they tend to be focused around 2 very, very important rivers, and that or spots where there are important rivers. First of all, Egypt on the west, and secondly, Mesopotamia on the east. And so you have the Nile River, which overflows its banks and gives tillable soil year after year. It's the breadbasket of the world. You have the communication between cities and so on. And you have the same thing in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. Mesopotamia means between the rivers, and so you have these rivers that water the countryside and so on, give easy communication and travel. Now the point is that the way you travel from between Mesopotamia on the east and Egypt on the south and west is via this highway, which Breasted of the University of Chicago called the Fertile Crescent. And the Fertile Crescent, well, here I'll go back to it. The Fertile Crescent can be defined, this is dangerous on a Saturday afternoon. It gets a little warm in here and you've had good lunch. Oh, my goodness. I am throwing myself off the pinnacle of the temple here, I'll tell you that right now. But I'm tempting the Lord. But no, the Fertile Crescent is defined as a sickle of land which stretches from Mesopotamia on the east to Egypt on the south, on the west. A sickle of land which can be traveled, tilled, and settled. And here's the big issue, and which is surrounded on all sides by terrain where none of that is possible. So if you're going to travel, you have to travel the Fertile Crescent. Now, honest to goodness, and I should have saved what we just looked at for this, but here's a little better map. But again, what's at stake here, of course, is the mountains to the north and the desert to the south and so on. And so if you're going to, and if it's you and your buddy, okay, you can make your way maybe across the Arabian desert. But if you're going to move an army or a caravan, you're going to follow the crescent. Now, here's the point. And I tell people all the time, Randy, that if there's one little tiny factoid which I can share with you, it is that I've done something, and my clicker doesn't work anymore. I don't know what it is. What have I done here? Huh? Still on. I'm still getting a blink, but there I went. Good. Now I can do it. Huh? I know I'm making you seasick, but yeah, and I appreciate that, but that may have been what. All right. I'm going to go back. All right, folks. Honest to goodness, I'm losing here. But what the point is simply the point that I always make, Randy, is that if there is one single little tiny factoid of geography that you need to learn about the Old Testament to understand what's going on, it is this one tiny little isolated fact which has ramifications that are absolutely enormous. And that is that the only truly narrow spot on the Fertile Crescent is Israel. That is the one spot where there are other spots where it gets narrow, but the one spot where virtually all the traffic is going to be funneled into one area is here in Israel. And that's why everybody who wants to control the Eastern Mediterranean world has got to control this little tiny piece of land. And I give you here just sort of in the red there is this marvelous, wonderful Jezreel Valley, that the most important valley in the history of man. I mean, there have been so many. I've seen figure 42 history-making battles fought on this on the little tiny arrowhead-shaped Jezreel Valley. But the importance is that now you have actually two international on the highways. On the east is the King's Highway, but that becomes very, very secondary. And the traffic wants to go, I'm talking about commercial or military traffic, caravans or armies. They want to go, for instance, if they're coming down from the north, from Damascus, Syria, they're coming across from the Fertile Crescent, from Mesopotamia and so on, they're going to come down, and they can take one of a couple of routes. They can go north or south of the Sea of Galilee, but they're going to be funneled into the Jezreel Valley. And what they're after is to get on this coastal plain highway called the Via Maris, that's where you want to travel with your, so what? Well, and by the way, to take it another step, it's going to be funneled into the Jezreel Valley, and the Jezreel Valley is defined on the south by Mount Carmel, and there are three passes which make their way through that, and two of them are the ones that are most important to the international traffic. But the point is, now watch this, if you can control those three passes, you can have functional control of the great majority, I think, or so much of the international traffic in the ancient world. And furthermore, guess what? You can tax that traffic. This is what Herod, I think, made him so hideously wealthy that he couldn't get rid of his money going in. Now, he found other sources of revenue. He built a harbor and captured a lot of trade, and he built a temple and brought just boatloads of Jewish money into his coffers. But the fact is that he was given at a remarkable time. We call it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, when trade is exploding and so on. But he is given this entire stretch, and he is able to tax all that traffic. So I'm saying to you that international traffic is funneled into this little tiny land. And that's, by the way, what makes it so terribly, terribly strategic. I say to you that this is what, in spite of the fact that Israel, throughout most of her history, has had no natural resources and so on. It's very hard to defend this little land and so on. It's a terribly, terribly difficult land to live in, especially in the hill country. But Israel has always been sought after. All right, but how does that relate to what we're talking about? In the ancient world, people were anxious to hear what was going on in the world. But you couldn't get a message from here to there any faster than you could get a person from here to there. And there would be professional heralds, professional, I don't know, they would attach themselves. They'd go and they'd study this battle or sit in the hillside and watch this battle, or they would hear about this new invention. They'd go and witness it, or they would hear about some court coup, and they would go and study it and so on. And then they would attach themselves to caravans. And this is how you traveled. And they didn't have anything to sell. They didn't have any wares. But they wanted to travel safely. And everywhere they went, as they followed these caravans, they tested everywhere they went. They would be invited into the best homes and they would be feted and so on because people wanted to hear what was going on. Folks, the fact is that these caravans, the most of them, are going to make their way through Israel. And as they do, they're going to hear these remarkable... And I'll tell you something. People wanted to hear about what was going on in this little tiny land because they knew how pivotal it was to international politics and so on, geopolitics. And so the point is that these caravans would be funneled into this land, and they would hear... one of the ways in which God likes to identify himself, again and again in the Old Testament, he's the living God. Now, you know what that means? He can do things. He can actually intervene on behalf of his people, as opposed to all these gods that are nothing more than a face carved on a hunk of wood, for heaven's sakes. And so these stories, here's what I'm saying to you. God shaped the earth in such a way that the accounts and we just saw it. We just saw it. How 400 years later, to be sure, it's close by, but even in Persia, all those years later, they understand who this Yahweh is, who his people are, and how he protects his people. So what I'm saying to you is that, number one, as it says there, God is not neglecting or rejecting other people, but I will argue, and I know that this is a point of some contention. I could tell you some stories. But I would argue that in the Old Testament, God did not command Israel to go to the world. They didn't establish mission agencies. I know everybody goes to Jonah and regards that. Oh my goodness, I won't tell you the story, but I have a son named Jonah. So I rather took offense. I was at a recruiting at a college, and the speaker that they chose, one of their grads, just beat up on Jonah. I swear, I don't think he thought Jonah was going to be in heaven, for heaven's sake. Oh my goodness. And it was all about xenophobia and all this sort of stuff. I'd love to talk to you about Jonah. I better not go there. But let me just say this. Don't read Jonah. Well, I'll leave it alone. If I start, it'll take me too long. But the point is that in the Old Testament, God did not command Israel to go to the world. He told Israel to stay in the land, and God, through his dealings with Israel, and because of the way he had shaped the face of the earth, as those stories of God's dealings with Israel spread across the earth, men would be impacted with the character of this God Yahweh. Does that make sense to you? Honest to goodness, that's what's going on. Now, two things about it real quickly. We got 2 minutes, and that's all I'll take. Number one, this dynamic that God is going to put himself on display. He's going to make known his character to the nations of the world by planting a nation in this unspeakably strategic spot where all the traffic of the world is going to be forced through that little spot. And these stories are going to be carried to the ends of the world. That strategy is not in any significant whit dependent on how many individual Israelites are genuinely twice born. Now think about that in comparison to the church. And to say that Israel in the Old Testament is just the church in the New Testament, it just won't work. The fact is that in the Old Testament, God is dealing with Israel as a people. And he said to Israel that I set before you a blessing and a curse, a blessing if you obey and a curse if you disobey. And the second point I wanted to make is that, number one, as I say, the strategy does not really depend upon how many individual Israelites are believers. And secondly, it doesn't depend on Israel's honoring their God. Because he said, I set before you a blessing and a curse, a blessing if you obey and a curse if you disobey. Now we, mankind, likes to invent a God of our own making. And he's always just a kind, pat you on the head. Like I always say, he's avuncular. Do you know that word? I like the word avuncular. Look it up. Now, I'll tell you what it means, but this is honestly what it means. Like your favorite uncle. That's what it means. And so And so, there's this kind of God in heaven who sits you on his knee and bounces you, gives you a little candy, and sets you off to play. And that's not the God of Scripture. And I think this is at least in part what Paul has in mind when he says, after rehearsing God's dealings with Israel, "Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God." And it's important to know that God is a faithful God. He's a loving God. He's a caring God. He's a shepherding God. But it's just as important to know that he is a holy God, and he's an avenging God, and he will not tolerate sin. And when Israel obeyed, God put on display his remarkable grace and love and so on. When they disobeyed, the Old Testament is really about God's faithfulness to his covenant and Israel's fecklessness with that covenant, faithlessness to that covenant. And what you come away understanding so compellingly is that God is so quick to bless the slightest. Who's the slightest obedience? Who's the most wicked king in the Old Testament in the south? In the southern kingdom, I'm sorry? It's Manasseh. Manasseh repents and is restored, and at the end of his life, 50 years, how long does he reign? Over 50 years, I think. And 52 years. And then he's carried off to Assyria and repents that quick. God restores him and doesn't restore him to the king, but brings him back and so on. Who's the most wicked king in the north? Married Jezebel. Ahab. When the prophet says this is what's going to happen to you, he repents that quick. God says, okay, I won't do it to him. I'll do it. God is so quick to bless repentance and obedience. He is so certain, if long-suffering, to punish disobedience. So see where I'm taking you? What I'm saying is that, A, God's intent with Israel was always that they would be a light to the nations. But B, the primary strategy is quite frankly geographic. And he planted Israel in a place where the caravans of the world are going to be funneled right through that place. They're going to hear these stories. They're going to hear stories of both God's goodness to Israel and God's punishment of Israel. And those stories are going to be carried over the whole earth so that Mrs. Haman can say, ooh, if you're messing with the Jews, you're going down. It's really staggering. But I want to say again, we're not talking about a church. Here we are working so hard to make sure that the people in the church are twice born and so on. There's none of that. This is a strategy entirely different. All right, well, I'm going to pick it up right there in a few minutes. So should we just take 15 minutes, or do you need?
Yeah, I got 3 quick things.
All right, do it.